What's up, everybody? Welcome to Mets Off Day Live. I'm your host, Chelsea Sherrod, and today I'm so happy to be joined by two friends of the show, host of the Mets Pod, Joe DeMayo, and the Athletics, Will Sammon. Let's get right into it, guys. The Mets are 4-2 since their return from the AllStar break, including a sweep of the Angels. They're riding a 4-game win streak. Joe, what are your thoughts on the Mets' performance since the AllStar break?
A bit up and down, more up lately, which is a good vibe to come into this show. But it started off a little rocky. The first game out of the break, I thought maybe a little prematurely kind of punting the game. Like the way that the pitching was handled was a little odd to me. And Saturday, you had a couple uncharacteristic errors on David Wright Day from good fielders like Ronnie Mauricio and Luis Torrens. But then they turn around, they win Sunday, and they take care of business during this series with the Angels getting the sweep. And shout out to the Mets bullpen, which we'll talk about the bullpen throughout the show, but the bullpen was a big reason that the Mets were able to pull off the series sweep against the Angels.
Yeah. Well, what do you think?
Yeah, things got better toward the end. I think that we have to start at the top with the top of the lineup. There was some concerns about, hey, what's going on here with our best players? Francisco Lindor, Juan Soto, Pete Alonso. Their combined numbers, I think it was about 4 hits or something like that heading into that final game of the series. So that was not going to be good enough. For them, they were fortunate to get some contributions from the bottom half of their lineup for a little bit of a change, actually. And I think that we saw some intel as to how the front office views this roster, because we saw some good things from their bullpen. We saw a little bit more promising signs out of Sean Manaea. So, there were some things to like heading into this West Coast trip, which would give them a little bit more information on some of these guys.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit more about Sean Manaea. So he made his third appearance of the season yesterday against the Angels, pitching 5 innings and allowing just 1 run on 2 hits. Joe, how do you evaluate Manaea since returning from injury?
I mean, I think he's looked pretty great. Not exactly the same as last year. The results have been obviously fantastic, and he's still being built up from a pitch count standpoint. I imagine his next time out, he'll probably get into that 90 pitch range. But the one thing that I actually want to see him improve upon is so far this year, he's been a 2-pitch guy. It's been 4-seam fastball and sweeper. He's only thrown his slider and changeup 2% and 1% of the time, respectfully. And that's something that is going to have to change as he goes throughout this season. And maybe it's still a bit of an acclimating time for him, and we will see those other pitches come into play. But it's just hard to envision this sustaining if he's going to be mostly a 2-pitch guy. But look, you can't argue with the stats that are right below my face. And ERA just over 2. He's striking guys out. So all in all, Manaea is not perfect, but looking like the guy that the Mets had for the second half last year maybe wasn't a fluke.
Okay, and to that end, Will, do you have confidence in Manaea returning to the level of pitcher that we saw last season down the stretch?
I do, as long as he stays healthy. That's the biggest component for me. I don't really mind him focusing on the 2 pitches, actually, because I feel like he has pretty good command of those 2 pitches. And he's sort of simplified his approach here, which may be a good thing for him, because if you look back at his usage chart from, say, September, when he was really locking in on his command, it was pretty much 2 pitches. And so I think he's kind of carrying that a little bit into this season and just focusing on that for now. But Joe, you're right in the sense that I think that 3rd pitch or even a 4th pitch to keep guys honest down the road definitely is something that's going to be part of the equation here. But I don't really mind the 2 pitches. I just feel like the health is the biggest component with Sean Manaea. So they've done things a little bit slowly. He was at the 65 pitch mark, that range, for a little bit longer than I think most starters go for. He had done it maybe 3 or 4 times in that same range. So I'd like to see them boost it up a little bit, but it's one of those things where with Sean, you're going to have to be pretty careful, because it's not just that one injury in the spring with the oblique. He had setbacks clearly after that. So you got to tread a little bit carefully here. He's also an older guy, and he's also coming off of a season where he pitched a lot of innings for you. And he also looked like he got tired down the stretch last year. So there's a lot to keep in mind with Sean Manaea, but I feel like as far as just the quality of pitches, I'm pretty enthused by it. I like what I've seen from him, and I think the numbers bear that out.
All right, great perspective there. Sticking with pitching, after a solid start in his return from a hamstring injury, Kodi Sanga struggled against the Angels, giving up 4 runs in 3 innings on Monday. Joe, was this just a bad start for Sanga, or do you think that he's still dealing with the injury?
No, I would amount this to largely a bad start. he wasn't exactly going to carry an ERA like under 1.4 for the whole season. So inevitably, he was going to have some starts that weren't ideal. He wasn't consistent with his command and his location. And he said after the game, too, that his mechanics just didn't feel like 100% right. So these days are simply going to happen. You're going to have bad starts from time to time. But I firmly believe if Kodi Sanga stays on the field, he's going to be a very good pitcher much more often than not. And that's the key, much like Will was talking about with Manaea. The Mets need to find a way to keep Sanga on the field because this year, obviously, you have the leg injury, and last year had the calf injury. So it's just a matter of, can you keep Sanga on the field? And if you do, I think largely he's going to be very good.
And so, Will, just following up on what Joe just said, how should the Mets monitor his rest days and innings pitched to ensure that he's fully healthy for the playoffs?
I feel like there's only so much you can do because a lot of the times they are giving him that extra day. Pretty much every single time this guy pitches, he's getting that extra day. And I foresee that to continue. The days off in the calendar help them out a little bit so they don't necessarily have to go to a sixth starter right away here. I'm sure they will eventually when they need to, like we saw in the first half of the season. But with Kodi Sanga, I feel like you just got to have the shackles off a little bit more or as much as you can, because at some point you're asking this guy to be one of your top 2-3 starters, and that means giving some length here and going into the sixth inning and being that guy a little bit more consistently. So I think that's a big part of why things are the way they are with their bullpen, is because of David Peterson's been that only guy, and it's not supposed to be that way. Like, they're supposed to get this from Sean Manaea, they're supposed to get it from Kodi Sanga. So you don't want to be reckless here, but I think that eventually you're going to have to ask Kodi Sanga to be that guy for your pitching staff, and he's talented enough to be that guy. I was pretty shocked that he had a bad start. He almost never has bad starts. So, first inning aside, like, he's always a little bit rocky in the first inning, which is a story for a different day, I guess. But, that start the other day just kind of surprised me because we're not used to seeing that. So not that it was alarming by any sense. I mean, it's going to happen, like Joe said, but it's just to say that this guy is really, really talented. And they're going to need to count on him to provide a little bit more on the inning side of things once he gets his legs underneath him.
Yeah, because you don't want to continue to put more stress on your bullpen. And speaking of innings, Klay Holmes is quickly approaching the innings limit he set before the season. I believe it's about 160 innings. He's at about just over 108. Andy Martino recently wrote for SNY.TV that while moving Holmes to the bullpen isn't a plan for the Mets, it's not entirely out of the question. So, Joe, do you think that the Mets will ultimately need to move Holmes to the bullpen?
I think it's an inevitability more likely than not, but I think there's a lot of people that are like, oh, the Mets should just go trade for a starter and then shift Klay Holmes to the bullpen. I don't think it's necessarily that case. And I know there's the old school, like, you should only go up blank amount of innings a year and all these type of things. But the Mets are going to handle Klay Holmes with how he's feeling and how the stuff plays. We have technology nowadays that could tell you if stuff is regressing or if things aren't being the way they should. And then Klay Holmes needs to ultimately be honest with the Mets about how he feels. But if you look down the road, getting towards the playoffs and the end of the season, Klay Holmes is probably not going to be in a Mets playoff rotation, at least certainly not the early rounds where you only utilize 3 starters. So if that's the case, he's going to play a role out of the bullpen. And as you mentioned, Chelsea, that innings count of 160 is still like a decent amount away, but it'll sneak up quick if he keeps starting. So I think at some point the move to the bullpen is probably going to happen. I just don't think that's necessarily imminent.
No, I think that's a great point. Will, do you think that the Mets can preserve his innings while keeping him a starter, or would that put too much strain on the relievers? We just talked about not trying to put too much stress on the pen. Can they keep Holmes as a starter?
Imagine by design going 3 innings, right? Like that's it almost sounds crazy, but I wouldn't put it past them to do that eventually, because like we're talking about, this is not somebody that they signed thinking that he was going to go give them 6-7 innings, especially not at this time of year. So they had the idea in mind of like, okay, we were encouraged by what Luis Severino, for instance, gave us after missing all that time heading into last season and the amount of innings that he provided the Mets. So they liked what they were able to do from a health component there, and they saw Klay Holmes a little bit in a similar sense. That said, if he regresses a little bit, if he shows signs of fatigue further fatigue or just show signs of regressing from a performance base, they're going to have to consider it. And I think that you could monitor his innings, though, while also starting him and not necessarily moving him completely to the bullpen, because this is also a little bit of a long-term thing for Klay Holmes, right? Like, you don't want to go back and forth with this guy. This is somebody that you signed to be a starting pitcher. You told him he was going to be a starting pitcher. He came here because he wanted to be a starting pitcher. And it's a little bit weird to kind of back away from that, even though there is a team need. I'm not saying that it's all up to Klay Holmes, but it's part of it, right? It has to be this kind of conversation. He has to be part of this thinking and this sort of plan to kind of be on board with whatever his role is going to be. And I just bring that up because it's something that they have to consider as part of their future. This was a guy that's looked to be a starting pitcher, is supposed to be a starting pitcher next year, has already made a lot of progress, mind you, with the volume. So you don't want to just completely backtrack on that. So there's a lot at play here. I do think, though, to wrap it up, that 3 innings of a start, they can look to do something like that, 3, 4, 5 innings max kind of thing. And then maybe it sort of depends on what your rest of the pitching staff looks like. If you're utilizing those young guys that David Stern's talked about, or maybe you're bringing somebody else in differently to absorb those innings.
And speaking of the rest of the pitching staff, I want to get both of your perspectives on this, but I'll start with you, Joe. How confident are you in the Mets pitching staff as it currently stands?
I think Will brought up a good point there about Holmes, just to follow up on that really quickly. Those young pitchers, Brandon Sproat or Noel McLean, someone like that, I think that could fit as like a piggyback type of scenario, maybe behind Klay Holmes. But overall on the staff, my confidence in the talent of the Mets starting rotation is probably like a 7 out of 10. I feel good about the talent in the rotation, but now there's questions about the health of Sean Manaea, the health of Kodi Sanga, how many innings are left for Klay Holmes, and how you're going to kind of work him out over the last couple months of the season. Frankie Montas has a history of injury, and he missed obviously a bunch of time earlier this year. So a risk standpoint, I'm feeling a little uneasy, which makes me almost want them to try to get some floor in the rotation over the next 7 days before the deadline comes and goes. But from a talent standpoint, I think the Mets rotation is fine.
Okay. What do you think, Will? How confident are you in the Mets pitching staff as it currently stands?
So I'm a little bit more confident than I was a few weeks ago. And part of my confidence, my increasing confidence, is actually it has to do with AAA and not necessarily the major league level, although that's part of it as well for me. But in AAA, Brendan Sproats looked very good recently. And I think that when you look at the Mets depth and you say to yourself, who would be next if an injury happens or if they need to utilize another starter, it could be at this point Brandon Sproat or Nolan McLean. And I feel a lot better about those chances than I did a few weeks ago. And Brendan Sproat has pitched a lot better a few weeks ago, and I don't think that's a coincidence as far as my thinking on that and his performance. I think it's together that has led me to think that. So that's part of it. And also just I really like what I saw from Sean Manaea as well. I do feel like he's on the upswing. And if Kodi Sanga could get right and give them the innings that he's supposed to be giving them, you do have a lot to feel good about. I'm a little bit surprised that my reporting has told me that they're not really looking for that mid-tier or that back-end starter to, like you said, Joe, give them a little bit of a cushion. But at the same time, I believe that it's because of what they have in AAA, which looks a lot better than it did a few weeks ago.
Okay, Will, coming back to you. With Jose Butto and Brooks Raley returning to the bullpen, they have more depth, but the Mets likely need another arm in there. Are there any names that you think the Mets will target?
Well, I feel like with relievers, it's a little bit tricky because, like, once you say, hey, they're in the market for a reliever, there's like a bazillion relievers out there. So it's like, it's hard to kind of pinpoint right now, especially as we are a week ahead of the deadline, because there's so many different guys, whether they're closers with some club control, like a Class A or a Duran, who you just don't know for sure yet is going to be in the market or not. So aside from those guys, there's plenty of other like 7th, 8th inning guys that make a lot of sense, whether it's like a Griffin Jax from the Minnesota Twins or a Hunter Gaddis from the Cleveland Guardians, guys like that who, in whether it's been this year or in years past, they've shown the ability to offer you some command with also some high strikeout rates. And I feel like that's what's been missing sometimes from the Mets bullpen is they need more swing and miss, I would argue, and they need a little bit more on the command side, because as much as some of these guys like Reed Garrett, Brazoban have been pretty good, they've been also a little bit inconsistent. And sometimes it's because of their issues with command. So I feel like to raise that floor would be significant. And I know you mentioned those couple of guys in Brooks Raley and Budo who are coming back. I'd still argue that they need at least to add two more prominent relievers to their mix just to make sure that they have enough, because you can never really have enough. But from their sake, just that you have a group of guys that you feel good about going to the seventh or the eighth inning ahead of Edwin Diaz.
Yeah, Joe, what do you think? Are there any names that you think that the Mets will target?
I love Griffin Jacks. That would be my top guy. If you told me I could have any potentially available reliever, Griffin Jacks is the one that I'm going for. I'm with Will. They have to add two relievers here in the next 7 days in my eyes. And frankly, I would ideally have one that either is a closer or a closing caliber pitcher, because thinking even beyond the next couple months, the way Edwin Diaz is pitching, he's going to opt out of his contract. And if he opts out, what do the Mets want to do? Do they want to get into another long-term big money deal with a closer? Doesn't really seem like a David Stearns thing to do. So maybe some protection there wouldn't be bad. And I want a second lefty here. And I not only want a second lefty, I want one that's different than Brooks Raley, because, there's been rumors about Danny Colomb from the Twins. And I believe we'll talk some mock trades later that include a lefty from Pittsburgh. I want someone with different stuff than what Brooks Raley has. And my eye is on Gregory Soto on the Orioles, who would be a rental. He's had some postseason success. He's certainly been around a little bit, but that's a hard-throwing strikeout type of pitcher. And I think fits kind of Will's point that the Mets need some more swing and miss in the bullpen. And then the byproduct of that is it shifts Reed Garrett down. It shifts Ryan Stanek down. It shifts Huascar Brazoban down. And then the bullpen, frankly, if you told me they got Gregory Soto and Griffin Jacks, for example, I think the Mets would have an incredibly strong bullpen.
Okay, yeah, definitely lots for the Mets to consider and lots for us to monitor over the next 7 days ahead of the trade deadline. But like the infamous saying goes, guys, the best ability is availability. And so they're definitely going to need those arms down the stretch, especially in the playoffs. Okay, so we talked pitching. Let's talk hitting now. Francisco Alvarez returned to the team after dominating in the minors in 2 games back. He's shown glimpses of his potential, including a key 2-run homer in Tuesday's 3-2 win. Joe, how was Alvarez able to find his rhythm at the plate in AAA?
He went down there. Of course, you're facing AAA pitching, which helps at least a little bit. But I noticed he was getting back to kind of his old mechanics that worked when he was coming up and he was a top prospect. Opened his stance just a little bit. His hand placement was a little bit different. And you saw him putting power to all fields. And one of the things that I think maybe is not talked about enough, when he fractured the hamate bone in spring training, one of the things when you hurt your hamate bone, it takes power a while to actually come back. So this might just be Francisco Alvarez actually being healthy from it. And then he is a guy that rides on confidence and swagger. Like you could tell before the Mets sent him down, whether it was that sort of little league play where he randomly threw the ball to second base against Atlanta instead of doing any other option in that rundown. It seemed like he was in his own head, both at the plate and at the plate as a hitter, and then behind the plate as a catcher. Now I think he's coming with a little more confidence, and it's 2 games, so I'm not here to say Francisco Alvarez is officially back. But if he is 85% of what we were hoping, or 90% of what we were hoping Francisco Alvarez would be, that's a major factor for the Mets in the second half as they look to lengthen their lineup.
Yeah, I was saying that during his time in AAA, it did kind of feel like he got his swagger back in a way. And he kind of looks like he's just being more present at the plate and not really overthinking. Will, so how can the Mets ensure that Alvarez maintains his confidence at the plate, especially in high pressure situations?
Yeah, as corny as it may sound, at the risk of sounding pretty corny, just reminds him that being himself is good enough. Like, just be yourself, because that's a pretty good player if you're just Francisco Alvarez and you're not really trying to worry about being like this perfect hitter and whether or not like that was the right take or swinging at such and such pitch. Like, you don't want him to get crazy here, but like the slugger that we saw as a rookie is probably pretty good enough for this particular lineup, because you're not asking him to do a whole lot. Like, the power that he provides, I don't care how much he strikes out. Personally, I think that like his ability to consistently access that power, that's probably going to be the most important thing for them. And yes, you want him to put together at bats, but like you just want him to feel good about what he's doing. And the results help there. So I think it was critical that he got off to a really good start in the major leagues. But he came here in a pretty good space. I think that the coaching staff in AAA and the Mets development staff did a lot of work on this guy to kind of help him get to where he is right now. And he wanted it as well, which is important to say, because David Stearns would have given him a couple of days to kind of get his head right and to kind of just, forget about getting demoted or whatever. He didn't need it, or he didn't want it, Francisco Alvarez. He went right to work. And I think it's worth mentioning that, because this is somebody that didn't sulk and that just focused on what he wanted to improve. And for him to just be at this spot, I think it's huge for the Mets. And all they really need to do is remind him that it's good enough, because that type of player is pretty much exactly what they need. A little bit of power toward the bottom of their batting order.
I didn't think that was corny, but I do appreciate.
I appreciate that, Chelsea.
If you consider it corny, but it is as simple as that. Will, let's switch gears to Brett Baty. He has a 1.166 OPS over his last 6 games. That is the highest on the team. So, Joe, is Baty slowly winning the everyday third base job with his bat and his glove?
If you want to even stretch it out, go back to June 24th, so exactly a calendar month. Baty's hitting 290 with an 852 OPS over that period of time. So to me, Baty has earned everyday playing time somewhere, whether that is third base or second base, because as we know, the Mets will deploy Ronnie Mauricio sometimes at third. They'll deploy Mark Vientos sometimes at third. But Baty, this is just a guy that the trials and tribulations that he's been through, up and down, struggles here, success at AAA, he looks confident. He looks comfortable. He's putting together professional at bats. He's turning on inside fastballs. Like, this is the Brett Baty that I think a lot of people were hoping that the Mets were going to get. But the other side of the coin here is that he's had hot stretches before, and then it's kind of fallen off. So now it's a matter of finding more consistency. But with these young players, what I think the Mets ought to do is just try to ride hot streaks with any of them. So Mauricio was hot for a little bit, like a month ago. He got everyday playing time. He cooled down. Baty heated up, and he took over the everyday playing time. So I think that's probably the best way to approach it.
Okay, so you believe that Baty has earned everyday playing time. Will,
yeah.
You mentioned the other infielders. Could any of these 3 players become trade targets at the deadline? What do you think of Mauricio, Vientos, or Baty?
They all appeal, and I'd even throw in Luis Angel Acuna in there as well, because they all appeal to other teams for a variety of different reasons, and it sort of depends what that other team needs as far as, which one you want to put 1, 2, 3, or 4. And for the Mets, they've not necessarily been dangling these guys in trades, but they have received phone calls on them, and they've been open to dealing one of them because it's a surplus right now. It's an area where they have some depth, and they don't have depth everywhere else, right? Like, they don't have a bunch of great center field options. They don't have a lot of elite back end relievers. So if it's a place where they can feel like they have room to upgrade, I could definitely see them trading from this area of depth, because these guys are pretty talented players. They have not yet reached their potential. They've shown some glimpses. They've shown some signs. Brett Baty probably more so than others, of course, this season. But even Mark Vientos, like, the guy hit a bunch of home runs last year, and then he hit a bunch more when it mattered most in the postseason. So other teams have not forgotten about that. And it really just depends on what type of return the Mets would get in return here, because they're not just going to give these guys away either. Because, like I said, there's a lot of versatility here. There's a lot of flexibility here. And right now there's enough at-bats to even go around with the way that Carlos Mendoza is configuring his lineup, even if Brett Baty, say, gets the bulk of the playing time at third base. Like, you could still have Mauricio at second when McNeil plays center field. You could still have Vientos getting a bunch of DH at-bats now that Winker does not appear to be anywhere close to returning, unfortunately, for him. So I feel like there's a lot at play there, and it just really depends on what you're getting back from a different team if you are going to trade from that surplus.
Oh, yeah, really important points made by you there, Will. Thank you for that. Back to prospects, though. Joe, who in the Mets farm system has the best chance of making the big league lineup this season?
Big league lineup? I'm going to go with what David Stearns said in his media availability. I don't think there's anybody that's going to make it to Queens as an offensive prospect this year. I think largely what you're seeing, the young players, that glut of infielders, those are the young players I think that are going to impact the offensive side for the rest of the season. On the pitching side, we've talked about Brandon Sproat and Nolan McLean. And I think by hook or crook, the way pitching injuries happen, knock on wood, hopefully the Mets can avoid that. But just the amount of pitchers that you need, I'd be pretty surprised if at least one of them didn't make their big league debut in the second half.
Okay. David Stearns did also express concerns about using pitching prospects in relief roles, saying it might be difficult for them to transition back to starting. However, given the Mets win now approach, should they take the risk and use these prospects in the bullpen?
Let's see what happens after the trade deadline, because I think that will dictate how much of a need that becomes. Because if you get enough relief help through trades, then you don't really have to do that, because you don't know how good those guys are going to be in those roles too. So it's not just like the health component or the production of like, okay, we don't want to shorten, say, Brandon Sproat up to 2 or 3 innings because now the rest of the season he's not going to be able to go 5 or 6 and proceed along that sort of production volume chart that we want. It's also like you don't know how he's going to react to being in the bullpen, especially in the major leagues. So you probably want to see it a little bit in the minors before you go to it. And I think that if you're able to get external help anyway, it alleviates the need for that kind of thing. Although I would argue if you're going to ask Klay Holmes to pitch a little bit less innings, if you don't feel all that encouraged by what you've seen from a production standpoint from Kodi Sanga, then sure, it makes some sense to do so with Nolan McLean or Brandon Sproat, to bring them up and to ask them to give you 3 innings or so out of relief in a piggyback way. I think it would help. And as far as like why we haven't seen that maybe a couple of weeks ago when maybe it mattered or maybe it was a more acute need at that time, it's because of that very reason of like, hey, we don't want it to be like, we're going to try this and then we're going to yo-yo him and go back and forth with this. It's like once you do it, you're doing it, you're committing to it. And so it's a thing that in the past, when David Stearns did it with the Brewers, with Corbin Burns, Freddie Peralta, Brandon Woodruff, it was more toward the second half because the season's almost over anyway. So you're not asking these young guys to do a whole lot of heavy lifting anyway. So you're at the point where you make that decision and you're okay with it because the season's almost over anyway.
Yeah, and Joe, just like you mentioned, there isn't a clear path for many young players to reach the big league roster in the near future. So should the Mets consider trading top prospects for win now pieces?
You're tugging at my heart. By top prospects, I don't know. Right now, when I look at this deadline, I don't know that there's going to be players that are really available that are worth trading from the top of the system. It just doesn't seem like it's that type of market. But look, at the end of the day, there's not going to be room for everybody. So whether that is this month, this off season, because we're focused on right now because we are in the midst of 2025 and the Mets want to win a World Series, but you have to think beyond 2025 if you're David Stearns as well. So I think you will see some prospects traded in the next week. I think that's really the normal thing, is trading prospects for guys to help your team. But when you talk about the top of the system, I think David Stearns and the Mets are going to be maybe a little reluctant given the available inventory at the deadline.
Okay. Let's switch gears to mock trades. With the trade deadline just 1 week away, we asked Mets fans for mock trades the Mets should make. So we have 4 of them, and we'd like to know both of your opinions on them. So Joe, I'll start with you. Mock trade number 1 is from Sunny Days Zach. And they say Dylan Cease for Brandon Sproat and Drew Gilbert. What do you think?
This one's heavy for me. I think Dylan Cease is obviously not having his best year. Some of the stuff underneath seemed to indicate some bad luck, and maybe he will be better throughout the rest of the season. But man, talk about trading 6 years of Brandon Sproat. And Drew Gilbert is a guy I might keep an eye on as a potential trade candidate, not for any inside information, but just a little weird when I talked before about how David Stearns said he doesn't envision any position players impacting the big league roster. Well, Drew Gilbert has an OPS over 1,000 in the last month. So if he's not going to get an opportunity here, I wonder if that opportunity is more in the trade market. But to me, this is heavy for 2 months or 3 months of Dylan Cease, where ultimately he's a rental, and David Stern's history suggests it's not like they're going to trade for Dylan Cease and then give him a long-term contract to stay. So this one's heavy for me.
Okay. Will, what do you think of this mock trade?
I'm a no on it because of Brandon Sproat. I'm not giving him up for a couple of months of one pitcher. And Dylan Cease so far is not pitching like an ace. I don't really have the reasons for that, but he is not necessarily pitching like a number one. And so you cannot convince me that he's all of a sudden going to morph into that guy in a different organization and say be a CC Sabathia from way back in the day or anything like that. That's not what would happen here. So I think that you're selling Brandon Sproat a little bit short here as far as his value for you, even as early as next year. And the other side of that, though, is that I'm probably okay with trading Drew Gilbert. I just would not do Brandon Sproat in this particular trade example.
Okay. Mock trade number 2, Will, coming to you first. This is from DMR Mets. And they say David Bednar and Caleb Ferguson for Ronnie Mauricio, Drew Gilbert, and Kevin Parada.
It's not a bad deal. It's not a bad deal. And I'm hesitating just because I like Ronnie Mauricio too much to be like, yeah, sure. But it's probably not a bad deal. I don't mind giving up Gilbert or Parada here. Bednar has a little bit of club control left too. So that issue that Joe mentioned for next year with Edwin Diaz comes into play a little bit. Caleb Ferguson's a pretty good reliever to add to your mix. And so you're accomplishing a few different things there. So it's not really that bad of a deal. I personally just like Ronnie Mauricio way too much. I feel like out of all those infielders that we spent some time talking about, he has the highest upside. And I view him as a future all-star. So I'm not trading him in this capacity for a couple of relievers when I can probably get a couple of relievers of similar quality for a little bit less in return in what I'm giving up.
I agree with you. I'm a huge Mauricio fan. Joe, what do you think?
Yeah, this one is close, but I am deathly afraid of trading Ronnie Mauricio because I think, as Will said, I think he has the most upside of this group. And I could just envision us coming on an off day live sometime next year and be like, man, remember when the Mets trade Ronnie Mauricio? Wouldn't it be nice to have that guy with 20 home runs and 20 stolen bases at the All-Star break or something like that? Like, I could see that scenario playing out. So I wouldn't do it for that reason. But this is much closer, I think, to something that would be realistic. And maybe if you're the Pirates, this is exactly what you're asking for guys like this, because Mauricio could come and play every day for them. Frankly, Drew Gilbert's probably a guy they could call up and play in right field tomorrow, right? Like they're playing Tommy Pham out there. So I think this is maybe a realistic one, but maybe I'm a coward and I just don't want to trade Ronnie Mauricio.
I mean, we're also going to have to check back in this time next year to see if you're actually psychic, Joe.
Yeah.
We'll see if that actually happens. Mock trade number 3, Joe, I'll come to you first with this one. This is from Disco Ball Rules. And they say David Bednar and Mitch Keller for Mark Vientos, Jacob Reimer, Nate Dome, and Ronald Hernandez.
So this one, the other ones we were saying we don't want to do because it's too much. This one feels like the Mets aren't giving up enough in this package. Vientos, as good as he was last year and in the playoffs, there's questions about his bat going forward. He has to reestablish himself. And Jacob Reimer is having a breakout year. He's at the AA level now, and he's probably around a top 10-ish prospect in the system. And, Nate Dome, I'd probably put him in the mid-teens, and Ronald Hernandez is a back end of the top 30 if he's even in the top 30 anymore. I'll be re-ranking here in the next couple of weeks. So when you're talking about year and a half of David Bednar and then Mitch Keller being that floor starter that we spoke about with 3 additional years of control, this just frankly doesn't feel like enough to me.
Okay. Will, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I see it in a similar way, although I'll say like it's a fairly okay trade proposal, but from the Mets standpoint, I wouldn't see them necessarily doing it just because of their lack of need or their lack of want, from what I've heard, of a Mitch Keller type starter. Whereas, if it was maybe somebody like a number 1, then we're having a different conversation. But Keller, I'm looking at him as a solid number 3, a number 2 on a worse team type of guy. And when you look at the Mets rotation, it doesn't necessarily present a great fit for you because he's not like an automatic upgrade over, say, a David Peterson, Sanga, Manaea type. So it's a hard one for the Mets to be like, yeah, sure, we like that a lot. But as far as in a nutshell, the players going back and forth, it's not that bad of a deal for all the reasons that Joe outlined.
All right, to our fourth and final mock trade. We'll come to you. We'll start with you, Will. This is from Fisher8113. Sandy Alcantara for Brandon Sproat and Luis Angel Acuna.
Yeah, no shot for me. It's kind of a combination of like the Mitch Keller thing I just said. Sandy Alcantara was supposed to be that guy. He was supposed to be the ace, the face of this trade deadline in a way. But he was coming off the injury and just has not been able to live up to it. And so, again, you're trading for a guy like this, and you would have to expect him to sort of anchor your pitching staff, and he has not shown the signs to be able to do that and to be that number one guy for you. So I wouldn't give up Brendan Sproat, even if you don't even think he's going to be a future number one. He looks like he's pretty close to the major league level, and he looks like he could be a fairly solid major league starting pitcher. So I wouldn't part with all the years of control for something that you don't really know what you're getting from a health component with Sandy Alcantara this year and even beyond for that matter, not to mention the quality, because this is a guy that's, I think his ERA, even after his best start of the season yesterday, it's in the fives or the sixes. It's not very good. So it's been a long season so far already. It's already the end of July. And so to ask him to just suddenly turn things around and stay healthy, I think you're just asking a whole lot from a guy.
Yeah, I'm actually kind of shocked by this mock trade only because I feel like there have been a lot of mixed feelings from Mets fans as far as acquiring Sandy Alcantara, given the way that he struggled to start the season. Joe, what do you think?
I guess, what is your appetite for risk? Because this is the riskiest trade of all of them that were presented, because obviously coming off Tommy John, the performance hasn't been fantastic. The stuff hasn't exactly bounced back quite yet, which is not abnormal, but it feels like, honestly, this to me is probably exactly what Miami would ask for, or something along these lines, to get Alcantara right now. But to me, this is a stay away from this trade. I'm not ready to take that level of risk yet. If Alcantara stays in Miami and has a great second half, and it's just, okay, now he's bounced back to form, then in the wintertime, we can have that conversation, because right now the Mets can't really take a chance, I think, at this level to be like, yeah, we're going to make Alcantara into the Cy Young guy he was before in the next 2 months. Because if you're making that trade now, you're making it not just thinking like, oh, in 2026, he's going to be better. He needs to be a top rotation guy right now.
Yeah, I agree. I have a bonus question for both of you. I'll come to you first, Will. Name one player who you think the Mets will acquire at the deadline.
Well, at the risk of being very, very boring here and giving you a reliever, I'm also going to add who I want them to get. So who I want them to get would be somebody like Luis Robert. I'm a big Luis Robert fan. Who I think that they'll get is probably somebody like Griffin Jax or Hunter Gaddis.
Okay. Joe?
So I just want it on the record, Griffin Jax would be like the least boring move ever. I don't care what anyone says.
Really?
He's a monster.
No, it's kind of boring. Anytime you're headlining a deadline with a reliever, Joe, it's boring.
Yeah, that is fair. But I'm going to follow up with kind of the prediction and a want. I'm going to go even more boring on who I think they will get. A reliever, I will say Gregory Soto ends up a Met by next weekend to be that second lefty. But I want to follow up really quickly, if I could have 40 seconds of a soapbox about center field, because we haven't touched on it at all. Luis Robert, to me, is a perfect fit for this team, as Will laid out. I am not comfortable with the Mets center field situation right now. And frankly, I don't think the Mets really are either. David Stearns talked about, McNeil has made strides. And while I appreciate that, I can't imagine playing in the NLCS at Dodger Stadium and Jeff McNeil's trying to chase an Ohtani line drive into the gap. I don't think his range is going to play there, at least over an extended period of time. And Carlos Mendoza, when they asked, could he be an everyday guy? He was like, we gotta monitor his usage out there. And David Stearns was very non-committal there. I think a center fielder is a must. And Luis Robert, to me, while his last year has not been fantastic overall, he's a couple years removed from looking like a future MVP candidate. And one thing he does do offensively that'll help the Mets right now, the Mets as a team are hitting .231 with a .672 OPS against left-handed pitching. Luis Robert, despite barely being over the Mendoza line in general, is hitting .294 with a .966 OPS versus left-handed pitching. I don't think the Mets can realistically go into the rest of the season in the playoffs and say our offense is fine the way it is. So I want to see Luis Robert brought in, and I don't think it's going to cost you anything near the top of your system. So to me, it's a perfect like risk reward, potentially huge boom for the Mets. Sorry, that was more than 45 seconds, but the Mets need a center fielder, and I want Luis Robert.
I appreciate that center field soliloquy. You can do that whenever you'd like, Joe. Let's look ahead just a little bit, guys. The Mets head to the West Coast to face the Giants and the Padres. Will these next 6 games affect how the Mets front office views the roster and the moves that they need to make? How important are these next 2 series?
I don't think it will change things considerably because at this point you sort of know what you have. It's not like they're waiting on somebody to come up from the minor leagues and see, okay, is this guy going to make an impact for you? That's not really the case here. Their roster has been pretty set for a while, and they've seen enough, I think, from their roster to understand where they need to upgrade. If it's one area that my eyes will be on beyond the bullpen, it will be center field, just because I'm in agreement with Joe on you could make a strong case for that being where they're probably the worst at the Mets right now when you look at their entire season, and also where they could actually upgrade. And so David Stearns has talked about having that bar to clear when it comes to center field. For me, I look at it as, okay, you're getting pretty good defense from Tyrone Taylor. You're getting a pretty solid bat with Jeff McNeil, but you could move Jeff McNeil back to second base if you add somebody like a Robert. And to Joe's point about the cost, for the Mets system, you're not going to have to part with the top of your system for that because your system is that deep. The only sort of concern I have there would be other teams, like what other teams are able to present to the Chicago White Sox, because the Mets are not the only team that would be looking for a center fielder. And everybody knows that Luis Roberts' upside is probably the highest among the center fielders that are probably going to be available.
Joe, does anyone on the team have something to prove in the coming week?
And really quickly on the center field and the McNeil of it all, one thing I forgot to mention in my soliloquy was the byproduct of keeping Jeff McNeil in center field means you need 2 of those young infielders to be playing at a high level every single day. So if that's, to me, that is a little too much risk for my flavor. And, David Stearns, just go get Luis Roberts. It's going to cost you a little something. Just go do it. But as far as anyone that I think needs to prove anything to prove in the coming week, I'm just going to keep my eye on Francisco Alvarez. It was a great start. The first 2 games looking the way you want him to, but let's see that go over the next week and continue forward, because if Francisco Alvarez can become that number 5 or number 6 hitter in the order, that's a huge boon to what the Mets could do as they look to push to win the NL East and then obviously, hopefully, a deep run into the playoffs.
Yeah, I mean, we've been preaching this till the cows come home. Consistency is key for the young Mets. That'll do it for us here on Mets Off Day Live. Next week, we will have a trade deadline special on July 31st with Andy Martino and Jim Duquette at 3 p.m. as the deadline closes. For Chelsea Sherrod, for Joe DeMayo, for Will Sammon, thank you so much for joining us. Guys, always a pleasure to do this with you, and we will see you on the next Off Day.